Hi, welcome to the Shades of Motherhood Network. I am the Executive Director, Stephanie Courtney. I would like to thank you so much for coming to our online conference, Stronger Together, Community Care for Black Maternal Health.
Our guest speaker today is Dr. Shakesha Costict. Dr. Shakesha Costict is a doctor of philosophy in counselor education and supervision. She is also credentialed nationally and in Washington State as a mental health counselor, along with being a child mental health specialist. Dr. Costict's mission is to support the development of African American mental health counselors through mentorship, faculty, and administrative engagement. Dr. Costict is currently the Director of Student Success and Teaching Faculty at Antioch University, Seattle. Welcome, Dr. Shakesha.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today on this presentation regarding the importance of representation within the counseling field. I'm so excited to be here with you all today, and I'm so grateful and thankful for that wonderful introduction. So we're going to go ahead and dive into the presentation. And so the objectives, what I really hope that by the end of this presentation, you're able to get is to identify the impact of counseling stigma faced by African Americans. I hope you're able to explore and identify strategies to reduce stigma and increase access to mental health support within the Black community. I really hope the message comes across that you're able to identify and see the significance of incorporating cultural competence and cultural humility when working with African American clients impacted by stigma or mistrust. And finally, I hope that you are able to see how we can identify the importance of advocating for increased diversity among mental health counselors in communities impacted by the limited number of counselors in our communities of color. And so with all of these objectives, I think it's really important to maybe get a little bit of an understanding of why this topic is so important to me. So I have, my little pictures here right now, and really what I want to convey to everyone is the importance of being able to have a voice, the importance of being able to share what's going on with us. And I say that, and I have these pictures because little old me, beautiful big smile, but then also quieted within when it comes to kind of sharing about the things that were happening in life and feeling confident enough to really talk about what was going on. And as I've grown and become an adult, and looking at this piece of how important it is really to share, to open up, to have a voice, to talk about these things that are sometimes really uncomfortable to talk about. And that really leads me to this point of stigma and this conversation of why within the African American community, we have to be able to get to a point to have these conversations. And I say this because really what that does is, if you think about it, generally, not in every household, generally, conversations regarding our mental health, our mental wellness, counseling, things of that nature, at many times haven't really been talked about. This old tale of what happens in this house stays in this house has really been something ingrained within our community. And so when I think about those things, it really does kind of bring me to this first point when it comes to these objectives and this piece of like talking about stigma. And so as an educator, as a researcher, I always like to back up my content with known information, with the research. And so one thing that I've done here is I've kind of added this information when it comes to this piece of stigma. I think it's so important that we understand kind of there's this public stigma that we often know, feel, hear about counseling, mental health, diagnosing, things of that nature. But there's also this internal battle that many people face when it comes to their mental illness and their experiences. And so when we think about that, one thing that I want to be able to have you do in this moment is just think about what were the first messages you received regarding mental health, regarding counseling, regarding mental wellness. Like, just think about that. Like, how old were you? What age did you receive these first messages? For example, were these conversations, topics of conversations within your family? Were they not? I think it's, something to just, again, think about. When did I first really receive these messages? So as I shared, like for me growing up, yes, we talked amongst our family, but I don't ever really remember hearing mental health or hearing about the word counseling. And it wasn't even until I was a senior in high school that I heard about psychology and what this field of psychology was. And it wasn't until my senior year of college that I understood about and learned about counseling as a profession. Like and that was my first time really hearing about this. And so for others, though, it might be that maybe these conversations did occur in your family. Maybe you were aware, and maybe there were no stigmatized conversations around this piece of counseling. And so I often think it's so important that we truly take a moment to think about, like, are we portraying these messages? Are we in this space where we're attempting to break the stigma, or are we perpetuating these stigmas by not having these conversations? And so when I think about these messages and what has been received and what we often even hear now, stigmatization often hinders African Americans from learning about the importance of how to use mental health treatment. We often see that we don't necessarily have a lot of counselors of color, and I'll talk about that in just a little in a moment. But consider this. Research, like I said, I'm a researcher, so research has demonstrated how many African Americans are not utilizing services due to a lack of understanding regarding whether they need help or how to get help. So really think about that. Like, what does that mean? To me, when I read that, when I hear that, what I'm hearing is that we have individuals who are struggling with their mental health. They're having these many different symptoms and they're not sure what to do about them. And so they're not sure how to get help. But sometimes they don't even know that something is going on. Maybe there's this thought of, it's always been this way. This is how I've always handled this situation. And because of that, I don't even know if I need to go and see someone. And so I think it's so important that in order to get to the point where we're breaking the stigma, we have to be able to have these conversations and make sure that the resources that individuals need, that they have access to them. And so African American involvement with mental health includes unique issues such as how these experiences, these negative experiences, really play a role in, again, the underutilization of mental health services. So there's so many points and so many things that I think is important for us to think about. It's important for us to consider. And so as we do that, as we think about this piece, one of the main factors in a lot of our underutilization of services is this idea of mistrust or cultural mistrust. And so when you think about this, think about how the negative and traumatic experiences that we've encountered, that we've received in the medical system, and from the government, as well as in psychology in general. Like, think about that for a moment. This mistrust has a embedded layer in our ability to not utilize the services that are there for us. And so we have such a long history of the experiences as a community, as a culture, that have really impacted and perpetuated this piece of mistrust. And one of those is the Tuskegee Syphilis Study or experiment. If you have not had a moment to really dive into what that experiment was all about, I encourage you to do that. Because it's such a significant part of our history. It's such a significant part of our history, even when it comes to research, even when it comes to utilizing our medical system and being in these spaces. And so, this experiment really highlighted how researchers came in, and promised treatment to African American men in Alabama. The study started back in 1932 and lasted for a number of years. And these individuals were recruited, again, with the promise that they would receive medical care if they participated in this study. And really, if you think about it, 1932, I'm wondering how many actually had the option. And so one thing that we know is that these men did not give their consent to participate in this study. And unfortunately, many of them had some adverse reactions because they also were not given given the piece of like helping them to be able to receive treatment after having this introduced into their system. So some ended up being blind, some had some mental impairments, and some also unfortunately died. And so when we think about this and we think about what's embedded in our culture and our history, to me, this all goes back to this mistrust. And even though this was a different type of study, these messages have continued to have a thread throughout our culture for so many years. And so historically, we as a community have been negatively impacted by the injustice and the discrimination within the healthcare system. As a result of that, these negative thoughts and experiences are really getting in the way of us being able to seek professional help. And in addition to that, when you think about even looking at the provider, there are what we call provider biases that whether they're conscious or unconscious, and when your provider has a bias against the client that's coming in to see them, this can often lead to misdiagnosis, furthering this piece of this mistrust, creating more barriers to treatment and to helping individuals engage in treatment. And again, there's so much that's embedded in our experiences that have hindered our ability to be able to seek the treatment we need. And although we've seen this in the medical space, we also see this in the counseling space as well. And so when I really think about this, looking at this very first point here, African Americans often seek mental health support from either a doctor, from if you are a part of a religious organization, the Black church, and also from personal relationships within their families and friends and community members. We see that because, again, I'm not going to go to a counselor because that's not what we do. These messages are changing, and I'm definitely aware of that. But for some, these messages are still kind of embedded in their ability to seek support elsewhere. And I have medical provider there because we know that often, like many of these, like family, friends, church, the medical provider is often the first line of defense for someone or the first line of support. So if you think about when you go, at least for me, when I go to the doctor, what I get is a questionnaire to fill out, and there's usually a couple of points on there, questions on there about my mood. And one thing we have to do is be honest about what's happening. If we're noticing a difference in our emotions, in our mood, in our overall mental health, because then that provider can share different resources with you. So medical providers really are, again, a point of support often. We're more likely to go to the doctor because we're having other like physical ailments, not really connecting them to our emotional well-being or the lack thereof in that moment. And so when I think about this, I'm going to jump for a moment. So we talked about kind of the medical provider. I'm going to jump for a moment to the Black church. Whether or not you believe, that is perfectly okay. But I know for me and for the research that I've done when it comes to mental health and stressors, the Black church is usually the first place that many will seek guidance and support because it's a place of worship and spiritual connectedness, and it's a way to help you manage your life stressors, and you also get that support. So pastors really are this first line of support for many of their individuals in their congregations, and I think that's great. I also believe that we need to make sure, if this is, again, one of those first lines of support, that our pastors and our church leaders are equipped with the resources needed in order to make sure the individuals in their congregations are getting the best support possible. And so when I think about this concept of mistrust and this piece of stigma and kind of breaking that stigma, making sure individuals who need it have access to the resources, what I see a common theme here is that many within our communities will often go to individuals who have a non-counseling background. So these non-counseling professionals, the doctors, maybe, maybe not, but I'm speaking from doctors in a medical, way, the church again, and then another piece of that is really kind of like friends and family, which I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But oftentimes what we see is individuals kind of going to those individuals, those people who are non-counseling professionals for their actual mental health support. And so think about this for a moment. Who are you more likely to go to when you are experiencing concerns or stressors, even in your day-to-day life? So just think about that for a moment. Who am I really more likely to reach out to when I need help with something? So when considering the influence of friends and families as support for mental health concerns, even if they don't really know what to do, we still often kind of go to those individuals. This is similar to the church regarding African Americans sharing varying stressors with trusted individuals. And I say that because, and I'll kind of get to this in a moment within kind of the putting it all together, is we really will go to others, like the title of this slide says, using others for mental health, for our resources, finding our resources and our supports through others, family, friends, medical providers, the Black church, in order to help us seek treatment. And so I have, again, we know pastors are sometimes the first line of defense when it comes to that. So think about this. I was looking at this research, and it's from the Trauma Healing Institute, and this research took place last year, 2023. What they found is that 30% of congregations have individuals who've been experienced or exposed to some type of trauma. All right, 30%. We got that. Think about that from now, our Black churches. That number is higher. In churches serving predominantly Black congregations, Black congregants, 42% of those individuals have experienced some type of trauma. That's a much higher number. If overall, this study said that there were 30%, and within our Black churches, predominantly Black churches, we see that now there are about 42% of those members who've experienced trauma. And then we look at this piece that also within this research that has said that 36% of predominantly white churches were least likely to experience any type of trauma among their members. My question is, why is that? Like, when I think about this, I'm wondering, why is it within our churches, the majority of predominantly Black churches, there's a higher number of individuals who has experienced trauma? One reason I think this is because, again, we have this history of all of these things that have happened to us as a community, as a people, and those experiences follow us into every aspect of our life, including our experiences within our churches. And so when I think about that, it really gets back to the heart of this for me, that we want to make sure that our leaders within these spaces are equipped with the resources, with the services, so that we don't have to continue to live in this space of traumatic experiences, and that number can actually go down. And so when I think about this last point here, point number 3, one thing that I've noticed and I was really excited about is that what research has really shown us is that when you have someone who is either had experience with mental health counseling, or someone who's just aware of it, and then they go and share this information with someone who's struggling with their mental health. That person who's struggling is then more likely to go and seek services. So for example, if I am someone who's struggling with depression, and I have a very close friend of mine come and say, hey, I have utilized counseling services. I've had a great experience with counseling, and I think this might be something that you can look into and that might benefit you. I'm then more likely, as the person struggling with the depression, to go and seek out services. I'm also more likely to follow through with services at the recommendation of someone else. And so not only is it important that our leaders have these resources, but it's also important that our family and our friends also are aware of these different resources so that when someone does come to you, you're able to provide them with information that I think could be really helpful. So when we think about reducing stigma and increasing access to mental health, there are a couple things that we have to keep in mind here. One is that it's important for mental health professionals to be aware of the impact of stigma on the African American community. I feel like it's so important because you're not really going to get someone in this door to be able to provide these services if you're not aware of some of the struggles that have hindered them from getting to that space anyway. Like, we have to be able to, one, have these conversations, and as counselors, be able to really understand, like, what are the impacts? What are the things that are impacting and hindering people from coming to see me as a counselor? And so not only is it important for our mental health professionals to be aware of this, it's important for our medical professionals to be aware of this. Again, if you're going into the doctor's office and they're hitting you with that questionnaire, being honest about what's coming up for you when it comes to your mood. And I think it's important to be honest about that, because again, sometimes if we're not, and the professionals are seeing different things that are coming up, different symptoms, this can often lead to misdiagnosis. And I'll talk about that in a moment. We also want to make sure that our religious leaders are equipped, like I said, to provide whatever resources to increase access to mental health support. So our faith and spirituality are really a huge part of the recovery process when it comes to someone who this is a part of their core, their values. And when they're coming to counseling, their faith and their spirituality can be incorporated into their treatment plan, in addition to whatever else you work on in the counseling office with that client. However, this faith and the spirituality should not be the only component to helping someone increase access to mental health support. Again, going back to making sure our leaders have what they need in order to support our clients or future clients who might need some mental health support. We want to be able to invite others into this conversation. And then also we want to make sure that our community members, and by community members, I also mean family and friends, but that they also have access to different options when it comes to mental health support so we can reduce this stigma. That might include mental health resources. Be aware of what's in your community. Be aware of what those crisis lines are. I also, at the end of this presentation, I have a slide that has a couple of those resources on it, more national type resources. But I think it's important for you to know, like, okay, where are the counseling agencies? Where are the private practice agencies in my community? Who are the counselors? How can I access the crisis line? What are those numbers in case myself or someone I'm close with is experiencing a crisis? I also wanted to share, I have on here that as community members, as family and friends, we can also seek training. And one of those trainings is called Mental Health First Aid. And if you haven't heard of it before, it's really, like I said, a training for family and friends and individuals. And what it does is it helps you to identify those first signs of a mental illness, but not just mental illness, also substance use disorders, excuse me. This training really does give you some bit of an understanding of what to look for when someone is maybe going into a crisis and or experiencing some type of substance use disorders. And again, I'll have more information on that at the end of this presentation, but a quick Google search of mental health first aid will definitely take you right to their site. And I believe it's another great resource. And this resource is also can also be used by counseling professionals. So it's like it's open to everyone. And I don't think it hurts to know that these resources are out there, because what it's going to do is it's going to kind of help you feel more equipped for this particular work. And so when I think about kind of being equipped and focusing even more so on like the counselor part of it, or for you who might be interested in finding a counselor in the future, some things to kind of be aware of. I believe, and I know for a fact as a professional counselor, that our counselors have to continue to practice from a lens of cultural competency and cultural humility. And so you might be asking, what is that? What is cultural competence? What is cultural humility? And one of the things that I think is important to remember is that in order for us to become culturally competent, we have to, as counselors, we have to be able to develop this framework where we view diversity and multiculturalism from a particular lens. And so what this means is that you want to make sure, if you are looking for a counselor, that one, they've done their own work as counselors and as a supervisor where we train students to become counselors. It's really important that we have this discussion of, have you as a counselor, or have I as a counselor worked through my own stuff? Because if I don't work through my own stuff is going to creep up into the sessions of those counselors. And so we encourage counselors to be aware of their own personal and professional development before even providing services to clients. We have to, again, be able to work through these biases because they're going to impact the services that we are providing. We also want to make sure that our counselors are practicing from a lens of cultural humility. And so what this does is it looks at you as the counsel, or as the client, excuse me, are the expert of your own cultural journey. As the counselor, I'm also willing to learn from you. And so oftentimes as a counselor, what I would do is I would invite the client to share about their cultural background. What are some things that maybe we can even implement into the counseling relationship, into the counseling session, to help you feel more comfortable in the space. And so when looking for a counselor, it's so important that you pick up on those things, that maybe you even ask those questions, because we want to make sure, and especially as an African American, that the counselor that I'm going to has a little bit of an understanding about me and has a willingness to learn about me and has a willingness to kind of invite me into this space. And so I really think that it's so important that when we look at this from a lens of, again, cultural competency, cultural humility, think about this. What are some feelings or thoughts that come up for you when you think about having a counselor that might have a similar background as you do? What comes up for you in those moments? Also think about what thoughts or feelings do you have when you maybe think about having a counselor that does not have a similar background as you do. And I bring those questions here because there's something in doing my own research that I found called racial and ethnic matching. And what that means is that the counselor and the client of, are of the same or similar cultural background. What we know is that that really sometimes plays a role in whether or not someone might utilize counseling services. Now, what we also know is that sometimes that won't make a difference. Sometimes the counselor and the client don't have to be of the same background. But when it does make a difference, what we see is that there is more of a utilization of services. And I can say within this community, within my own community, here where I live, that really has played a big part in whether or not someone utilizes counseling services. Even as a counselor, I would often hear, do we have more Black counselors? We need more Black counselors in this community. How can we get more Black counselors in this community? Because there are a population of people that feel more connected in that way. And I think that is perfectly okay. I, as a counselor educator now working in higher ed, see the desire to have more counselors of color, see the desire and want to see more African American counselors in our communities, because I know that it's going to make a huge difference regarding those who really are interested in utilizing services, but feel like they can't necessarily do that because they don't have anyone that is similar or have a similar background to what they have and who they are. And so when I think about bringing this all together, when I think about this piece of how often, not always, as a community, we might go to our medical provider first because we're having ailments, but really not being sure how they are connecting to our mental health. We might go to our family and friends first to talk about things because we don't want to have this conversation outside of our family, outside of our immediate community. We might also go to our religious leaders because that's where I feel the most comfortable and that's where I feel safe. And so when I look at bringing this all together, looking at how we can reduce, decrease this stigma, and how we can increase access to mental health services, mental health support, one thing that always stands out to me is the importance of representation. When I first became a counselor, I didn't really think about, I thought about representation, but I thought about it from a lens of, I don't think I've ever seen a Black counselor. Like, I don't even know what it's like to know. And so it wasn't that representation was there for me to say, oh, that's a possible career field. But what I've learned over the years is that this representation matters tremendously. When we have a lack of diversity within our counseling field, it really does impact whether or not others see this as a possible career. How can we decrease this mistrust, change this mistrust to trust? How can we decrease this stigma within our communities? How can we make it so that those that are struggling are more willing to seek out counseling, in addition to using other resources for mental health concerns? We have to make sure representation is there. So as I've spoken over these last few minutes, I really hope that I've been able to share overall how important representation is. Because if we don't have that, we continue this mistrust, we continue this stigma, we continue this utilization of non-counseling services, people, professionals, when it comes to those, when we really need to seek mental health treatment, mental health counselors. So how can we begin to increase accessibility and also utilizing, increasing this accessibility, but while also looking at increasing counselors within our different communities to make sure that the representation is there? You know, we really do this by making sure that there's this thread that connects clients to counseling resources in our communities of color. That's the one thing that I've noticed, is that when we don't have these services in our communities, it's more difficult to go outside of your community to get these resources. Most people don't want to do that. So we want to make sure there's a thread connecting our clients to the resources within their own communities. We also do this by continuing the conversations within our schools, within our churches, within our families, within conferences such as this amazing conference. We have to have these conversations. We also do this by training counselors through a culturally competent and a cultural humility lens. And again, that training starts in our schools, our colleges, and our universities, and continues after students have graduated and they've entered the field. We also want to make sure we have these training programs, these colleges and universities, but not just that we have them, but we have them in our communities. That's one thing that I've noticed, is really this piece of, okay, we have these major colleges and universities, and they have these counseling programs, but those programs are not in the space where they need to be. And so research has really shown that when we have these counseling programs in our communities to support the underrepresented populations, we have a more diverse field of counselors going into these communities. So we not only have to have these conversations, we also have to have these training programs within our communities. And we also have to have, in addition to that, the actual teachers, professors to do this type of work. If we continue to look at this piece of this same question of increasing accessibility, decreasing stigma, we have to be able to pour into our counseling training programs. That will help us increase the number of African Americans utilizing counseling services. So what we know is that over the last few years, this conversation of counseling, seeking counseling, mental health, mental illness has really exploded, especially in our communities of color, especially in our African American communities, because we want to make sure that everyone is aware that these resources are out here. And so in order to do that, we still have to continue to pour into these programs, because we know that there are more African Americans now utilizing services. We also have to be able to understand that the stigma of seeking counseling within our community can hinder exposure to the career field. So when I was a kid, I never said I wanted to be a counselor when I grew up. For some, maybe that's the case. For me, it wasn't, because I wasn't exposed to this as a potential career field. So if we have training programs, if we have counseling centers, if we're having conversations in these communities, what it does is exposes a whole new generation of counselors to this particular, or future counselors to this particular career. And when we do that, what we do is we start to chip away at that stigma and we start to decrease that stigma so that there's now more exposure. And when we do that, the recruitment, another piece of this is kind of the recruitment, like I said, of diverse faculty in these counseling training programs. When we have diverse faculty of color, African American faculty, what we know is that helps with the retention of counseling students in these different programs. And so as a faculty of color, as an African American counseling faculty, it does my heart great. So when I see these students of color and they see me also being one of their faculty, because again, it says, okay, there's someone that looks like me. That's again why representation matters so much. We have to be in a space where we can continue to make sure in our education systems that we have the faculty, that we have the students, that we continue to pour into these different training programs, because I think it's so very important that we do that. And we know when we do that, we will have more professionals, especially professionals of color, especially African American professionals. And so as I kind of bring this all together, as I think about how we reduce this stigma and how we increase access to mental health counseling to support our Black community, as I think about how those usual first lines of support, medical professionals, family and friends, the Black church, one thing or a number of things that I think about is this piece of how do we stand up against this stigma? How do we continue to talk about this mental health? We have to recognize that stigma exists. And we have to recognize that this stigma is often perpetuated by historical and even recent experiences and trauma. We know that it's there. So having this awareness, this recognition that, okay, I know that this is there. We also have to recognize that we need to explore the different strategies. And when we explore these different strategies, what it does is it increases the use of services. So what are those resources? What are those things that we can have access to? We have to recognize the need to support and develop new counselors of color, African American counselors. That's a passion of mine if you can't tell already. Like this piece of I want to see more of us. And I want to say this because depending on where you're at in the country, you will see more African American counselors. But in some spaces, such as my own community, it's growing, but we don't have nearly as many as we should. We have to be able to stop being afraid of having the conversation. That's one way that's one of the main ways actually that we reduce stigma and then we increase access to mental health services is we have to be able to have these conversations. We can no longer not discuss it. We can no longer hide the conversation, hide away from it. We can no longer be afraid to have these conversations. We can no longer close the door on these conversations. We have to be able to stand up, like this slide says, to the stigma. We have to be able to have these conversations because if we don't have these conversations, the stigma is going to continue. And it's going to continue and be passed down to generations to come. And we'll be dealing with the same concerns. So, as I bring this presentation to an end, I really hope what you've heard is in order for us to reduce this stigma and to increase access, we have to understand what's at the root of it all. What's at the root of this stigma? What are some of those things that are really hindering our ability? And I say are, because I'm a part of this community as well. What's hindering us from feeling confident and comfortable enough to have these conversations? And so, as I shared a little earlier, I always want to make sure there's something that you can take away. And so I've added just a small number of resources here, not an exhaustive list by any means. When we think about what we can do, I always pass on this information. Our medical professionals should have this information. When I'm speaking to religious leaders, churches about mental health, I always make sure they have this information. We want to always make sure our family and friends in our community has this information as well. Again, mental health first aid training that anyone can attend to help you identify those signs and symptoms of a mental health or substance use concern. Our crisis lines. Again, not an exhaustive list because there's also a veteran crisis line that's not listed here. But we have a new suicide and crisis lifeline, a national line, 988. Super easy, hopefully, to remember. We also have some texting lines that are also helpful. A teen text line, because that's a presentation in itself. What our African American youth face on a daily basis regarding their mental health. I've also included here an information line, and this is mainly for Washington State. But if for some reason you don't know where to start, our 211 line can definitely help you identify some mental health services in your very own community. And so I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for listening. And I really, really hope that something has been said that will stir up in you. Okay, how can I make a difference in this space? How can I be someone who can help reduce that stigma while also increasing access to mental health support within this community? I've added my contact information here. Feel free to reach out to me if you need to. And I really thank you for your time today.